I don't like to talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I catch myself thinking back to those 3 days in the mountains, alone in a cabin I never should have rented in the first place. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or anything out of a horror movie. It was just people, real people, and something about the quiet, the cold, and being completely cut off from the rest of the world made everything feel worse. Started because I needed a break. I'd been burnt out from work, tired of traffic, deadlines, and phone calls. I wanted to unplug. A buddy of mine told me about this website that had listings for private cabins deep in the mountains, most of them owned by locals who didn't advertise on the big rental sites. I liked the idea of being somewhere quiet, somewhere private, somewhere I could think. I scrolled through the listings for a couple of hours and found one that looked perfect. A single-room wooden cabin, deep in a forest about 2.5 hours from the nearest town. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and no neighbors. Just a fireplace, a small generator, and a wood stove. There was a picture of it surrounded by snow and pine trees, with a small deck out front and a narrow path leading to a frozen stream. The host said it was best for experienced solitude seekers. That line made me hesitate for a second, but I thought it just meant it wasn't for casual campers or weekend tourists. The cabin was cheap, probably because it was off-season. Most tourists came in the summer for hiking or in the winter for skiing. I was booking in that weird in-between time in late November when the snow was starting to fall but the ski trails weren't open yet. That was perfect for me. I didn't want people around. I wanted peace. I packed my truck with everything I thought I'd need. Food for a week, extra batteries, 2 jugs of water, layers of warm clothes, a couple of paperback books, and a rifle just in case a bear or something else came sniffing around. I wasn't a survivalist or anything, but I'd been camping and hunting before. I knew how to manage out there. I left early in the morning and the first 2 hours of the drive were easy. Paved roads, clear weather. Then the GPS directed me onto a long dirt road that snaked up into the trees. After about 30 minutes of climbing, the road turned into packed snow. I had chains on my tires, so I kept going. Eventually, I reached a small wooden gate that was unlocked. There was a laminated note nailed to a post that just said, "Welcome. Cabin is 1 mile up." I opened the gate, drove through, and shut it behind me. That last mile was rough. The road was narrow, and the snow got deeper the farther I went. Tree branches hung low, scraping across my windshield. I drove slow, windows cracked to hear if I was hitting anything. It was completely silent out there. No wind, no birds, no animals. Just the crunch of snow under my tires and the occasional pop from my engine. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures. A-frame style, weathered wood, smoke chimney, small deck with a couple of chairs. It sat on a flat patch of land surrounded by dense pine trees, the ground covered in thick snow. No tire tracks except mine, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been out there in a while. I parked, cut the engine, and stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold. I stood there for a few minutes just listening. Nothing, not even a plane overhead. Just the soft hum of quiet that only comes in deep wilderness. I went up to the cabin, unlocked the door with the code the owner had emailed me, and stepped inside. It was small but nice. One big room with a bed, a table, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove in the corner. There was a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a shower that ran off the generator. A pile of chopped wood sat next to the stove, and there were blankets folded on the bed. I dropped my bags, turned on the heater, and lit a fire. That first night, I cooked a can of stew, read for a while, then just sat and listened to the fire crackle. The wind picked up after dark, and snow started to fall again, tapping lightly against the windows. I felt calm, safe. I slept like a rock. The second day, I woke up late. I stepped out onto the deck and looked around. The snow had stopped, but everything was coated in a fresh layer. I walked around the cabin, just enjoying the stillness. There was a path that led into the woods, so I followed it for a bit. About half a mile in, I found the stream. It was mostly frozen, with just a trickle of water visible in the center. I crouched down and listened to it, then turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something weird. There were boot prints in the snow. Not mine. I hadn't seen them on my way in. They were fresh, heading in the same direction I had just come from. I stopped and stared at them. They looked like regular snow boots, deep treads slightly larger than mine. They didn't loop back around. It was a single trail, like someone had come from the woods behind the cabin and walked in my direction. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I called out, but there was no answer. I waited for a while, then followed the prints a little farther, but they just veered off into the trees and disappeared behind a hill. I didn't want to go too far, so I turned back. The prints bothered me. I hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anyone. No vehicle tracks besides mine. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to shake it off. Maybe they were old. Maybe someone had been hiking through a few days ago. Still, I didn't like it. I kept the rifle nearby that night. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small noises, branches creaking, wind whistling. Every time I sat up in bed, everything looked the same. Still, normal. But around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something that didn't fit. It was a soft crunching sound, like someone stepping on snow slowly, not an animal. Too steady. I froze in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited for 10 minutes, then got up, grabbed the rifle and looked out the window. There was no one there. I stayed by the window for a long time. My eyes scanned the trees, the path, the deck. Nothing. I checked the door. Still locked. No new footprints. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went out and circled the cabin again. This time, I found something that made my stomach twist. Behind the cabin, near the back wall, someone had stepped close. There were fresh boot prints in the snow. They came from the woods, stopped just a few feet from the cabin, then turned back around. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anyone. But someone had been there, just feet from me, in the middle of the night. I felt sick. I went inside and locked the door again. I sat at the table with the rifle across my lap and tried to think. Should I leave? It would take me almost an hour to get down the mountain, and the roads weren't great. I checked my phone. No service, just like before. The satellite phone the host had left on the wall wasn't working either, just static. I told myself maybe it was a hunter. Maybe they didn't know I was staying there. But why come so close? Why walk all the way up here in the snow and then turn around? That day, I stayed inside. I kept the fire going and watched the windows. I didn't read. I didn't eat much. I just waited. The sun set slowly, and the snow started falling again. The wind picked up. Around midnight, the generator flickered, then died. Everything went dark. I had flashlights and candles, so I lit a couple and kept one by the bed. I lay there for hours, listening. The wind blew harder, shaking the cabin. The trees creaked and moaned. Every so often, I thought I heard movement outside, but I couldn't be sure. Then I heard the sound again. Crunching snow. Slow. Careful. This time it stopped right outside the window. I sat up and held my breath. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the wall, heart pounding. There was a long pause, then 3 slow knocks on the wall. Just 3. Not loud, not fast. Just enough to make the skin on the back of my neck crawl. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I waited. Nothing else happened. No more sounds. No more knocks. After what felt like an hour, I got up, checked the door again, and sat by the window with the rifle in my hands. I stayed there until the sun came up. When it did, I ran outside and looked at the snow. Footprints. They led from the woods, across the clearing, and right up to the wall where I'd heard the knocks. Then they turned around and went back into the trees. The same deep treads as before. That was it. I couldn't take another night. I packed everything, threw it into the truck, and started driving. The snow was deep, and I nearly slid off the road twice. But I didn't stop. When I got back to town, I went straight to a diner and sat there for an hour drinking coffee with my hands shaking. I didn't tell anyone at first. I didn't know what to say. Eventually, I emailed the cabin owner and told them someone had been creeping around at night. They replied a few days later saying, "Thanks, we'll check into it." Nothing else. I didn't go back. I didn't even leave a review. It's been almost a year, but I still think about it. About those footprints. About those knocks. about how I never saw a face, never heard a voice. I had no idea what I was getting into when I decided to stay alone in that old cabin deep in the mountains. It seemed like a good idea at first. I just wanted a quiet place to get away from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. I had been feeling burned out. Life in the city was starting to wear me down. The traffic, the noise, the same routine every day. I wanted to disappear into the trees for a while. Just me, my thoughts, and the quiet. I found the place listed on a small rental site. It wasn't one of those fancy platforms with ratings and safety checks. It looked more like an old classified ad posted by someone who barely used the internet. The photos were grainy and outdated. The description just said, *remote cabin, mountain views, no service, peaceful, bring supplies, *. That was it. No details. But something about it made me curious. The price was low, much lower than anything else I'd seen, and I figured maybe it was just someone old-fashioned trying to rent out their family place. I sent a message through the site, paid for 4 nights, and marked it on my map. It was a little ways outside a small town called Granite Ridge, tucked deep into the hills, surrounded by nothing but pine trees and dirt roads. I drove up there on a Tuesday morning. The main roads were fine, but once I passed Granite Ridge and started heading toward the cabin, the pavement ended, and I had to crawl along a narrow gravel road for nearly an hour. No other cars, no signs, just woods on both sides, sometimes opening into a valley or ridge. Every few miles I'd pass a rusted gate or an overgrown path that led to who knows where. It felt like I was the only person in miles. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was dropping behind the trees. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It sat on a little clearing at the edge of a steep drop-off, facing a distant range of snow-dusted mountains. The wood siding was dark from years of sun and rain, and the windows looked dusty. There was a narrow porch that wrapped around the front, and a woodpile stacked along one side. No garage, no other buildings, not even a driveway. Just flattened grass and tire marks from whoever had been there before. I stepped out of the car and listened. Nothing. Just the wind in the trees and a few birds. It was the quietest place I'd ever been. The door was unlocked. There was a metal key hanging from a nail next to the frame, but I didn't need it. Inside, the cabin was musty but clean enough. One big room with a bed in the corner, a table, a stove, a sink, a wood stove for heat, no electricity. There were a few old oil lamps on shelves, and a big cooler sitting against the far wall with a note on it that just said *, keep ice stocked, *. I brought my stuff in slowly, double-checking everything. I had food, water, a small propane stove, sleeping bag, flashlight, lanterns, a few books, and a notebook. I also had a large hunting knife I kept for self-defense, just in case. I wasn't worried about people out here. I figured I'd be completely alone. That was the whole point. The first night passed quietly. I made some canned soup, read a little by the lantern, then sat on the porch until the stars came out. There were so many stars up there. No lights from towns, no glow from roads or buildings. Just black sky and a million white dots. I slept deeply that night. The bed was hard, but I didn't care. It was the silence that helped me sleep. It was like the world had been muted. For once, there were no horns or sirens outside my window, just whined through the trees. But when I woke up the next morning, I had this strange feeling that someone had been around. Nothing obvious, nothing moved or broken, but I had this sense that the air had changed, like something had been disturbed, even if I couldn't see what. I shook it off, probably just me getting used to the place. I made some breakfast and decided to explore the woods behind the cabin. There was no trail, but the trees weren't too thick at first. I walked for maybe an hour, climbing slowly uphill, stepping over roots and rocks, hearing nothing but birds and my own boots. I didn't bring a phone because I knew there'd be no signal, but I did carry a compass and a small pack with water and snacks. After a while, I found what looked like an old path. It wasn't a real trail, just a faint line where the ground had been worn smooth. It seemed to lead deeper into the trees, and I followed it out of curiosity. I kept telling myself I wouldn't go too far, I didn't want to get lost, but the path kept drawing me in. Every time I thought about turning around, I'd spot something else. A pile of rocks, a tree that had been cut cleanly, a rusty tin can half buried in the dirt. Eventually, I came to a small clearing. In the middle of it, there was a pile of what looked like animal bones, bleached white, scattered in a circle, some cracked open. Maybe deer or something else. I'm not a hunter, so I couldn't tell, but they looked old, and something about how they were laid out made me uneasy. They weren't just dumped there, they looked arranged. I backed away slowly and headed back to the cabin. The rest of the day was uneventful, but I kept thinking about that clearing. Who had made that pile? Hunters? Locals? Or maybe an animal dragged them there. I tried to forget about it, but something in the back of my mind kept saying that I had just stumbled into a place I shouldn't have. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing small noises outside the cabin. Soft crunches like footsteps in the dirt, or maybe just branches falling. I got up once and looked through the window, but I couldn't see anything. The lantern light only reached a few feet outside, and beyond that it was just black trees. The next morning, I noticed tracks near the porch. Not boot prints, they were bare footprints. Human, but smaller than mine. There were 3 of them, coming from the trees and stopping just at the edge of the porch. No prints leading away. I stood there staring at them for a long time. My skin went cold. It hadn't rained or snowed, so they couldn't be old. Someone had been there in the night, barefoot, just standing at the edge of the porch, facing the door. I didn't know what to do. I looked around for more signs but saw nothing. I thought about leaving, but I still had 2 days left, and something in me didn't want to be chased out like that. I told myself it could have been a local kid, some drifter passing through, maybe someone who lived in the woods. But why barefoot? Why stop at the porch and then disappear? I carried my knife with me the rest of that day. I didn't go exploring. I stayed near the cabin, kept the door locked, and watched the trees. I didn't see anyone. Nothing moved. That night, I pushed a heavy chair in front of the door and left the lantern burning low. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something knock against the wall of the cabin. Just once. A dull thump, like a fist against wood. Then silence. I waited for more sounds, but nothing came. I didn't move from the bed until the sun came up. When I finally went outside, there was a new set of footprints. These ones were clearer. They came from behind the cabin and circled around. Still barefoot. Still no prints leading back into the trees. Like whoever it was just disappeared. I felt sick. I packed up my things and loaded the car, ready to leave early. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The car wouldn't start. No clicks, no sound. Just dead. I popped the hood and checked everything I could. But I'm not a mechanic. All I knew was that it had been running fine 2 days ago. There was no way to call for help. No phone, no radio. I had no choice but to stay another night and hike down to the main road in the morning. I spent the entire day inside with the knife in my hand. Every creak in the wood made my heart race. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. I didn't eat. I didn't read. I just sat and listened. That night, just after I blew out the lantern, I heard something outside the window. Not footsteps, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. Right up against the wall. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I lay there frozen for what felt like hours. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sky turned gray, I grabbed my bag and started walking. I didn't care about the rest of my stuff. I just needed to get out. The hike down was long. Took most of the day. My legs were shaking the entire time, and I kept turning around. Sure, I'd see someone behind me, but there was no one. Just trees. Endless trees. I made it to the main road by late afternoon and flagged down a logging truck. The driver didn't ask questions. He just nodded and let me ride in the back all the way to Granite Ridge. From there, I found a mechanic who towed the car up the next day. He said the battery had been ripped out. Not dead, ripped out. There were scratch marks under the hood. Deep ones, like someone had torn at the metal with their hands. I didn't go back. I didn't want the rest of my things. I told the rental site to remove the listing. They never responded. I still don't know who was out there, I don't know if they lived in those woods or if they were just passing through. I don't know if they were watching me from the moment I arrived or if I did something to attract them, but I've never felt anything like I had been needing a break from everything. My job, the noise, people, all of it. I worked in IT, always indoors, always behind a screen. My sleep had been messed up for months. Even when I wasn't working, I felt like I was wired to something. I needed to unplug from the world for at least a week. That's why I booked the cabin. I found it through a local listing. It was an off-grid rental in the woods, privately owned, not on any of the big booking websites. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin, basic furniture, a wood stove, solar lighting, and a hand pump for water. No Wi-Fi, no cell reception, just woods. That's what I wanted, just woods. The owner's directions were simple. Drive up a dirt road for almost 11 miles, then take a turn onto a smaller path that forked off between two boulders. There would be a sign with a deer skull nailed to a tree. I remember that part clearly. The directions actually said, "Turn right at the deer skull nailed to a tree. That means you're close." It sounded a little strange, but I didn't care. I wanted remote, and this place was deep in the woods somewhere in northern Idaho, probably an hour from the nearest gas station. I packed light, a big cooler full of groceries, a sleeping bag, a small axe, a hunting knife, flashlight, fire starter kit, and some old books I never had time to read. No laptop, no phone charger. I left the tech behind on purpose. I left early in the morning and made it there by the afternoon. The drive up the dirt road took longer than expected because it had rained a day or two before, and some of the turns were steep with muddy patches. My SUV wasn't made for serious off-roading, but it handled it okay. I remember the quiet getting deeper the higher I climbed. It was like the woods were swallowing the sound of my tires. When I finally reached the tree with the deer skull nailed to it, I stopped and took a picture of it with my old point-and-shoot camera. Something about it felt strange, like it wasn't just decoration. The skull was weathered and yellow, sun-bleached, with wire wrapped around the antlers to keep it attached. The sign under it had a single word carved into the wood: "Welcome." I drove another few minutes and then I saw the cabin. It sat in a clearing, about 30 yards across, surrounded by tall trees. The grass was knee-high in places. The cabin was exactly like the pictures. One floor, wide porch with steps, one window in front, tin chimney on top. It looked like it had been built decades ago, but it seemed solid. The door was bolted with a latch. A note had been nailed to it saying, "Key under rock to right of steps." I got out, stretched, and just stood there for a while. The air smelled like pine and wet leaves. There were birds, and somewhere far off I heard what I thought was a woodpecker. But no people, no traffic, no sound of anything man-made. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire in the stove, unpacked, made rice and canned chili on a portable butane stove I'd brought. I had a book open, but I kept looking out the window. The trees pressed in on the clearing. I couldn't see more than 20 feet into them, even with the sun still up. It reminded me of something I read once: how people are naturally uncomfortable in dense woods because you can't tell what's watching you. You can't see far, but things can see you. I brushed that thought off. I was tired, not thinking straight. The inside of the cabin was bare but clean. One twin-size bed, small table, 2 chairs, shelves with some pots and pans, and a broom. No mirrors, no decorations, no personal items from whoever owned it. Just wood walls and dim solar lanterns that gave off a warm yellow glow. I liked that. It got cold at night. I slept in my clothes inside the sleeping bag with the fire dying in the stove. I was alone and it felt good. The second day, I hiked around the clearing. I brought my knife and some trail mix, just wandering through the woods. There were no trails, no signs of animals, no broken branches, just forest. It was a thick mess of trees and bushes and fallen logs. After 2 hours, I made my way back by using the position of the sun and the clearing as a reference. I didn't want to get turned around. That afternoon, I was sitting on the porch eating a sandwich when I noticed something. It was faint, like something moved at the edge of the trees. I thought it was a squirrel or maybe a deer, but I kept watching. Nothing else moved. The woods were still. I told myself it was nothing. The forest plays tricks on your eyes. You think you see something shift behind the brush, but it's just light or wind. That night, I woke up once to use the bathroom. There was no toilet, just an outhouse about 10 steps from the cabin. I took the flashlight and walked out. It was silent. My boots crunched on the ground. I remember looking up and seeing a full sky of stars, brighter than I'd ever seen. But I also had this odd feeling, like I wasn't totally alone. It was just a feeling, no sound, no light, just a sense that something else was around. Passed after a while and I went back to bed. On the third day, I stayed in. It was raining. The roof held up well, though I could hear it creaking with the wind. I passed time reading, eating, napping. The more time I spent inside, the more I started noticing little things, like the way the bed was placed directly in view of the front window, and how there were tiny holes in the back wall near the roof, like where something small had been drilled then patched over. And on one of the beams in the back corner of the cabin, I noticed the wood was slightly darker in a round shape, like something had once been mounted there. Maybe a camera. I know that sounds paranoid, but it stuck in my head. That evening, it was still raining. I stepped outside to stretch and get some air. I was standing on the porch when I noticed something odd in the tree line to the left side of the clearing. It looked like a branch had been cut, clean through and hanging loose. But when I squinted, I realized it wasn't a branch. It was plastic, a little square shape. I walked over to it slowly. Took me a while to find it in the brush. It was a trail camera, one of those small hunting ones with motion sensors. It was strapped to a tree with faded bungee cords and half covered with moss. It was pointed at the cabin, specifically at the front window. The camera was old but still had power. A small red light was blinking. I stood there, heart thudding, rain falling on my hood, just staring at it. Who was using it? Was it the cabin owner? Someone else? Was it recording the cabin now? I pulled it off the tree and took it back inside. The memory card was still inside. I didn't have a laptop or anything to view it, but I took the batteries out to make sure it was dead. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about that camera. Why was it there? And how long had it been there? I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing every little creak of the walls, every brush of wind, every sound from the woods outside. Every time a tree branch groaned, I sat up. I left the flashlight next to me, gripping the knife inside the sleeping bag. The next morning, I packed up early. I couldn't stay. Something felt off. I had wanted remote, but this wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt watched. I double-checked the cooler, the bag, the cabin. I even looked under the bed, in the shelves, everywhere, just to be sure. I kept thinking I'd find another hidden camera or something worse. Before leaving, I wrote a note on the back of a paper towel and left it on the table. Found a trail cam pointed at the cabin. Removed it. You should know who put it there. Then I got in my SUV and drove back down the trail. Every few minutes, I looked in the rearview mirror. No one followed. I made it home that night. I didn't even unpack. I took the trail cam inside, put the memory card into an adapter, and opened it on my desktop. There were over 300 video clips. Most of them were blank, just trees swaying or birds flying past. But then I started seeing clips from a fixed angle showing the cabin window. At night, during the day, some of them showed me on the porch, eating, stretching, walking to the outhouse. Then I found a clip from before I arrived. It was nighttime, maybe 2 days before I got there. The cabin was dark, and a man was inside. I could see him through the window. He walked into the frame, shirtless, holding something. He looked like he was wiping down surfaces with a cloth. He didn't look like the cabin owner from the listing. Younger, alt, thin. He walked over to the bed, moved it a few inches, adjusted something underneath, and walked out of frame. I scrolled forward. More clips showed him coming and going from the cabin. Sometimes he was inside for hours. One clip showed him sitting on the bed, staring out the window, doing nothing. Then the clip stopped, and I started showing up, arriving with my gear, unlocking the door, stepping inside. The rest of the clips were all me. The worst one was from the second night. I was asleep in bed. The camera must have picked up something outside. In the frame, a figure appeared on the edge of the clearing, just barely visible. He crouched near the trees, watching. He didn't move for 5 minutes. Then he slowly backed out of frame. I didn't plan on staying at the cabin for more than a week. I just wanted time away from people, from traffic, from noise. I'd been working long hours at the warehouse for months, barely sleeping, eating at odd times, and dealing with problems I didn't want to think about anymore. My apartment didn't feel like a home. The city was too loud. I needed quiet. I needed something simple, something slower. So I searched around online and found a place out in the mountains, a privately owned cabin that someone had listed for short-term stays. No neighbors for miles, no phone reception, no Wi-Fi, no paved roads. Exactly what I was looking for. The listing said it was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The owner left detailed directions because GPS didn't work once you got deep into the forest. The cabin was tucked away in the hills near an old logging route that hadn't been used for decades. It had solar power, a small wood stove, an outhouse, a hand pump well for water, and a tiny kitchenette with a propane tank. No television, no radio, no electricity apart from the solar lights. It sounded perfect. A packed light, a few changes of clothes, food for a week, a good flashlight, a knife I always carried when hiking, and a battery-powered lantern. I also brought a notebook and some books I'd been meaning to read. Felt like a chance to reset everything, to just breathe for once. I told a coworker where I was going and when I'd be back. That was the last time I used my phone before turning it off and tossing it in the glove compartment. The drive up started simple. The highway gave way to a 2-lane road, which eventually turned into a dirt path through heavy woods. I followed the directions carefully, counting landmarks just like the owner described. Turn at the big split pine, past the boulder shaped like a couch, and so on. It was a slow drive because the road wasn't maintained. Roots and rocks jutted up in random places, and at some points the trees leaned in so close that they scraped the sides of the truck. After an hour on the dirt road, I reached the clearing. The cabin sat in the middle, just like in the photos, small, with dark wood siding, a green roof, and a little deck out front. A trail led off behind it toward the woods. Everything was still. No wind, no birds, just quiet. I cut the engine, stepped out, and stood there for a minute, letting the silence wash over me. It was exactly what I wanted. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I could hear my heartbeat in the quiet. No cars, no distant voices, just trees and sky and the soft creak of old wood as I stepped up onto the porch. The key was where the owner said it would be, under a flat rock beside the door. Inside, it was cozy but plain. One room with a bed, a small table, a few chairs, and shelves lined with candles and jars of dried food. There was a wood stove in the corner and a ladder leading up to a tiny loft. The floor creaked under every step. I spent the first day settling in. I walked around the property, checked the well pump, stacked some firewood, and read for a while by the window. That night, I lit a few candles and sat outside on the porch with my jacket on, just watching the sky turn black. No stars, just thick cloud cover rolling in. The woods looked darker than I expected, deeper, like they went on forever. At some point, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird all day. No squirrels, no rustling in the leaves, not even flies, just dead silence. It made the cabin feel like it was sitting in a bubble. I brushed it off, told myself it was just because I wasn't used to real quiet. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. The first night was restless. I kept waking up, thinking I'd heard something outside, a branch cracking, leaves moving. But every time I listened hard, it was gone. Just stillness again. At one point, I thought I heard something tap the side of the cabin, like a quick knock, but then it was gone. I stayed in bed, heart beating hard, telling myself it was probably a pine cone falling or an animal brushing past. Still, I didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. The next day, I went on a short hike. There was a faded trail behind the cabin that wound into the trees. It wasn't marked and hadn't been maintained, but it was walkable. I followed it for maybe 2 hours, keeping track of the turns and landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I passed some old stumps and a rusted piece of metal that looked like part of an old tractor. The forest was thick and uneven, the kind where you had to watch every step. Eventually, I reached a point where the trail vanished into underbrush. I stopped there, drank some water, and turned back. Back at the cabin, I noticed something strange. The front door was open. I remembered locking it. I always lock doors, even out in the woods. I stood there for a minute, staring at it. Nothing looked disturbed, but my bag had been moved. Not opened, not rifled through, just shifted slightly. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten to shut the door tight and the wind blew it open. But the wind hadn't been strong, and even then, the door was heavy. It didn't make sense. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept hearing things, soft scraping, like something brushing the outer walls. Once I thought I heard something thump the roof. I lit the lantern and sat up for hours, staring at the walls, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside while I was gone. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was soft from recent rain, and sure enough, I found prints. But they weren't boots or shoes. They looked barefoot, wide, human-sized, but with a strange shape to them, like the toes were spaced too far apart. And there were more than one set. They circled the cabin and led off into the woods. I stood there, staring at the prints for a long time. My stomach turned. I felt like I was being watched. I backed up toward the porch, slowly, without turning around. Every sound seemed louder. A twig snapping, a breeze through the leaves. I went inside, locked the door, and stayed in for the rest of the day. That evening, I started hearing tapping on the windows. Not loud, just light, slow, deliberate. One tap, a pause, then another. Sometimes from the side window, sometimes from the front. I didn't go near them. I sat on the floor with the lantern off, listening. I didn't sleep at all that night. My knife stayed in my hand the whole time. The next morning, I made the decision to leave early. I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything quickly, opened the door, and froze. Something was on the porch. A dead squirrel laid out neatly. Its eyes were missing. Its legs were stretched straight out like someone had posed it. There were small cuts along its sides. Not teeth marks. Clean, straight cuts like with a blade. I stepped around it, got to my truck, and tried to start it. Nothing. The engine clicked, then went dead. I popped the hood. The battery cables were gone. Cleanly cut like someone had used wire cutters. I checked under the truck. The brake lines were slashed. I went cold. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. Someone wanted me stuck here. I locked myself back inside the cabin, trying to stay calm. I still had food, water. I could last a while, but I needed a plan. I decided I'd hike out. I'd take the trail back down the road as far as I could. Even if I had to walk the whole way to town, it was better than staying there. But when I looked out the window, the trail was gone. The path behind the cabin, the one I'd walked twice already, was blocked. Trees had been felled across it. 3 of them, thick trunks laid down like a barricade. Not windblown, cut. The edges were smooth, too clean to be natural. That night was the worst. The tapping started again, but louder, then scratching. I heard something heavy walking on the porch. The boards creaked. I held the knife tight, hiding in the corner, lantern off. I didn't move. Then something slid against the wall, a dragging sound. When I finally looked, I saw something hanging in the window, a piece of paper, smeared with something dark. It had a shape drawn on it. A crude figure like a human, but twisted. Limbs too long, head too small. I didn't sleep at all, just waited for morning. I ate nothing. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. At first light, I opened the door and ran. I didn't take my things. I just ran. Through the woods, away from the trail, pushing through branches, stumbling, falling. I kept going until I hit the old logging road. I followed it as fast as I could, not looking back. Every sound behind me felt close. Every snapping branch made my heart lurch. After hours of walking, I reached the place where the forest opened a bit, and I finally saw a car. Someone passing through in an old pickup. I ran into the road waving my arms, nearly getting hit. The driver stopped, and I begged for help. I never went back for my truck. I never contacted the owner. I didn't report it. I didn't want to explain any of it. I just left, went back to the city, changed my number, moved apartments. But even now, sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear tapping on the window. And sometimes when I check outside, I was 32 when I decided to get away from everything. I didn't have a breakdown or anything like that, but life had worn me down. The constant notifications on my phone, people asking me to be somewhere or do something, coworkers always wanting a favor. I didn't hate anyone, I just wanted space. So I rented a small, off-grid cabin about 5 hours away from the city. It was deep in the woods, about 12 miles off the main road, down a rough gravel trail that barely counted as a road. It was advertised as a hunter's cabin, and the pictures showed a weathered little structure surrounded by trees, with no visible neighbors in any direction. That was exactly what I was looking for. I packed up my SUV with enough supplies for a week: non-perishable food, a small gas generator, some firewood, extra blankets, water, and a few basic tools in case something needed fixing. I also brought a folding table, a chair, and my laptop, mostly to journal. The plan was to disconnect completely. I even left my phone off once I arrived. No reception out there anyway. The cabin itself was more rugged than I expected. No insulation, just wooden walls, a tin roof, and a door that didn't shut flush unless you yanked it with both hands. Inside was a tiny wood stove, a cot with a thin mattress, and some old shelves filled with mismatched tools, pots, and leftover gear from previous renters. There was a single window above the cot. It didn't lock, but it slid shut. Not that it mattered. No one else was out there. At least that's what I thought. The first day was peaceful. I got there in the late morning and unpacked everything, then took a slow walk around the woods nearby. The trees were thick and old, mostly spruce and fir, and they stood so close together in some places that the sunlight barely made it through. It was dead quiet, not even birds chirping, just the sound of wind brushing branches and the occasional creak of old trees. I felt good. I chopped a few small logs and started a fire in the stove before dusk. I ate a can of chili and read a paperback under the weak light of a small lantern. When I finally lay down, the silence was so heavy it almost felt loud. Still, I slept well the first night. The second day, I explored farther. I went deeper into the woods, about a mile past the cabin in different directions. I didn't see anyone or anything out there. No signs of animals either, which I found a bit strange. Usually in wooded areas like that you at least see signs, tracks, scat, disturbed leaves. But it was like nothing lived there. It was just still and lifeless. I chalked it up to the time of year, early autumn, getting colder. Maybe the animals were already burrowing in or moving elsewhere. That night I noticed something odd, though. I had just finished writing in my journal and was about to go to sleep. The fire had died down to glowing coals. I lay on the cot and looked up through the window above me. The sky was clear, stars everywhere. I stared for a while, then rolled to my side and closed my eyes. But just as I started to drift off, I heard what sounded like a branch snapping outside. It wasn't close, maybe 30 yards off behind the cabin, but it was sharp and clear. I opened my eyes, lay still and listened. Nothing. Maybe it was a tree settling. That happens. I closed my eyes again. A few minutes passed. Then I heard something else. Lighter, like leaves being brushed aside. A rustling. Then nothing again. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe something wandering near the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been moving deliberately. The silence afterward felt too sudden. In the morning, I walked out to the spot behind the cabin where I thought the sound came from. The leaves were undisturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. If there had been something or someone out there, they hadn't left a trace. I brushed it off. The third night was when things got worse. The day itself was fine. I wrote a lot, made some soup, and sat outside wrapped in a blanket watching the wind through the trees. But that night, just as I was climbing into the cot, I heard it again. A soft crunching, closer this time. maybe 15 feet from the window. I sat up slowly. No lights outside, no floodlight or porch lamp. So I couldn't see a thing through the window except the vague outline of trees and my own reflection in the glass. I held still and listened. More rustling. Then it stopped. I waited another 10 minutes, heart pounding in my chest. No sound. Then, just as I began to settle back down, something knocked on the wall of the cabin. Once. Just a single knock. A dull thud. Not loud, not frantic. Just one. I sat up again, frozen. I stayed like that until my legs started cramping. No more knocks. No sounds. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I searched the perimeter of the cabin. There were no tracks, no scuff marks on the walls, nothing out of place. I told myself maybe a branch had fallen and hit the wall. That was possible, right? But the knock had sounded deliberate, too clean, too centered. That evening I didn't write, I didn't read. I just sat on the cot, staring at the door, the window, and the black woods beyond it. I kept a hatchet next to me, one I had brought for chopping kindling. I didn't feel safe. I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, small ones like breathing. I kept telling myself it was in my head, but it didn't feel that way. By the 5th day, I was thinking about cutting the trip short, but I kept arguing with myself. There was no proof anything was wrong. Maybe I was just rattled by the silence. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. Maybe I wasn't as comfortable being alone as I thought I was. That night it rained hard. It hammered the tin roof like a drum. The noise was constant. That should have masked everything. But even over the rain, I heard something outside the cabin. Movement. I turned off my lantern and listened hard. Something was stepping through the wet leaves. Slow, careful. Then I heard something brush up against the door. Lightly, like a palm. That's when I really started to panic. I grabbed the hatchet and crept over to the door. I didn't open it. I just stood there, breathing quietly, every muscle tight. I waited maybe 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing. Eventually I slid back onto the cot, but I didn't sleep a second that night. I just stared at the door and waited for it to open. By the 6th day, I decided I was leaving. It was still raining in the morning, and the ground had turned to slick mud. I packed everything as fast as I could. I threw things in bags, didn't bother folding or organizing. I put out the fire, locked the door, though that felt pointless, and started the SUV. The tires spun in the mud, but I made it onto the trail and started driving out. The road was washed out in places. I had to go slow. Branches hung low over the path, some dragging across the roof of the car like fingers. I made it about 5 miles before I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the road. It wasn't huge, maybe 10 inches thick, but it blocked the way. I got out, opened the back, and pulled out the hatchet. It would take time, but I figured I could chop it enough to move it or drive around. I got to work. I had been chopping for about 20 minutes when I heard something in the trees to my right. A footstep, then another. Not animals. Heavy. Human. I stopped and looked into the woods. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. I stayed still for a long time, then slowly turned and walked back to the SUV. I threw the hatchet in, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for almost an hour. Eventually I got out again, finished chopping the tree, and dragged it aside just enough to get through. My hands were shaking. I was soaked from the rain. My boots were caked in mud. I drove the rest of the way out without stopping once. When I got home, I showered twice, ate fast food, and turned on every light in the house. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't think they'd believe me, but something was out there. I know it. 2 weeks later, I checked the rental listing online. The cabin had been removed. I emailed the site asking why. They replied and said the property had been taken down for safety reasons. That's all they said. I'll never go back there again. And I don't think I'll ever be the same. Not because of what happened, but because of what could have happened. I keep thinking about how close someone or something was, just feet from where I slept. Watching, waiting, and I'll never know why.